Sup, freaks? It's your boy Marty here to introduce this episode of Tales from the Crypt. I had the immense pleasure of sitting down with Corey DeAngelis, who's the director of school choice at the Reason Foundation. This is an episode that's not really focused on Bitcoin, but the subject of freedom of choice when it comes to educating your children. This is a very interesting subject, and I thoroughly enjoyed my conversation with Corey, who has done a ton of research in this realm and is on the front lines combating a push to ban certain types of schooling and education, predominantly homeschooling. So I think if you guys are liberty-focused, liberty-minded, you're really going to enjoy this episode. This episode is brought to you by our good friends at the motherfucking Cash App. You freaks already know all about them. They're helping you stack sats, send sats, receive sats, and sell sats, if you so please. They're also making sats the standard, so you're not stacking fractions of Bitcoin anymore. You're stacking whole sats. Feels much better that way when you're stacking whole sats. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions to tens of millions of sats at once, depending on what your purchase habits are like, or your stacking habits are like, all made easy on the Cash App. On top of that, they have Cash App investing. If you're one of those freaks out there who's interested in the stonk market, I'm not personally interested in it, but I'm a big fan of optionality. Cash App investing is allowing you to stack slivers of stonks. If you have a favorite stonk, it's a little too expensive, you can buy as little as $1 with the Cash App via Cash App investing. You can stack a sliver of a stonk. Cash App investing is a subsidiary of Square, a member SIPC, and because Cash App is directly connected to your bank account, there's no 4 to 5 day waiting periods to stack sats or stack slivers of stonks. You can start investing and stacking today. Where am I going next with this? What was I going to say? Yeah, we'll just get into it. If you do download the Cash App, when you do download the Cash App, I know what I was going to say. Cash App may even be your bank account. And they have account numbers and routing numbers now, so you can start direct depositing paychecks into the app, becoming your new bank. Pretty chill. If you do download the app, make sure you use the code STACKINGSATS. That's STACKINGSATS. You're going to get $10, and $10 is going to go to our good friends at Owls Lacrosse in Chicago, doing incredible things for the youth of Chicago. That's Owls Lacrosse, not that dirtbag Al who's a scumbag. He never coached lacrosse. This is a wild story he's running with on the internet right now, is that he actually coached a team that I played for. Again, he was that weird guy in the parking lot that would do weird things when we were trying to leave practice, when we were entering practice and leave practice. I don't know why our coaches didn't take care of it. I don't know what dirt he had on our coaches, but he's a dirtbag. It's not Al, it's Owls Lacrosse in Chicago. That's Owls Lacrosse. All right, I hope you guys enjoy this episode with Corey DeAngelis. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. If you guys are liking this podcast and you haven't yet subscribed on your local podcasting platform, please do so. Rate, review, share. If you guys are liking the content, spread it around. We're here trying to help educate people about Bitcoin and liberty in the digital age. Enjoy. Take care.
You've had a dynamic where money's become freer than free.
If you talk about a Fed just gone nuts, all the central banks going nuts.
So it's all acting like safe haven.
I believe that in a world where central bankers are tripping over themselves to devalue their currency, Bitcoin wins. In the world of fiat currencies, Bitcoin is the victor.
I mean, that's part of the bull case for Bitcoin.
If you're not paying attention, you probably should be.
What is up, freaks? Welcome back to Tales from the Crypt. It's your boy Marty Bent here on a lovely Monday afternoon. Very excited for this conversation. Not really Bitcoin related, but very pertinent to freedom in the digital age. I'm sitting down with Director of School Choice at the Reason Foundation, Corey DeAngelis. Corey, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
No, thank you for taking some time to sit down and chat a little bit. As I was describing to you before we hit record, this podcast focuses on Bitcoin because as freedom lovers, I believe Bitcoin provides leverage to individuals to maintain some sovereignty and liberty in the digital age. You came across my radar a few months ago when you were commenting on the attempt of some Harvard professors to mandate state-sanctioned schooling on individuals and to put a presumptive ban on homeschooling, and seeing your reaction to that and the sense that you talked on that subject specifically, I had to reach out and get you on the podcast. So I think just to get the freaks more acquainted with what you do, you can explain why you focus on homeschooling and what you're doing at the Reason Foundation.
Yeah, I mostly focus on school choice or educational choice, whatever you want to call it. And homeschooling fits into that kind of option set that's outside of the residentially assigned government-run school. And just really quick for your listeners, the way I define school choice is just that anything that gets you away from that residentially assigned government-run monopoly system. In the United States, in most locations, the default is that you live in a certain location, residence, and you're assigned to a particular government-run school, and most of the time you cannot escape that residentially assigned option, which leads to a lot of monopoly power in the education system overall. And if you want to escape it to get to a private school or homeschooling option, you don't get any of your money back in the forms of property taxes. And so again, that also leads to high transaction costs associated with exiting that residentially assigned option, which leads to horrible quality levels in the government-run schools and not a lot of options for families. So anything that gets you away from that, whether that's charter schools, government-run school choice, or something called open enrollment choice, where you just erase the district boundaries, private school vouchers, which Milton Friedman talked about starting in 1955, which we actually had private school vouchers even before then in the United States, in Maine and Vermont, which we can talk about in a second if you want to. But that's essentially the idea, that you're residentially assigned to a particular school, a government-run school, and if you want to go somewhere else, you can take a fraction of those dollars that would have went to your government-run school and use it to pay for private school tuition and fees. That's the basic idea of the voucher, that you should fund students instead of systems. The money should follow the child to the best school. And then the other type of school choice is an education savings account, which can be used for homeschooling. So it's like the voucher idea where you get some of that money, but instead of just being able to use it for private school tuition and fees, you can also use it to offset the cost of homeschooling using like private tutoring. And you could use it for a private school tuition if you want, but you don't have to use it for private school tuition. So anything that's broadly defined as an education expenditure. Another way to think about it is kind of like universal basic education income, I like to call it as well, to get those who support Andrew Yang to support the idea as well. So, but yeah, we should talk a little bit about the whole controversy and these huge attacks on homeschooling just as everyone started doing it because of the COVID-19 lockdowns of brick and mortar schools. Essentially, we moved from having 3% of the school-age population within a couple of weeks homeschooling in the United States to having essentially everybody homeschooling in one way or another, whether that you define that as remote learning from your district-run school, or doing a virtual charter school option, or just homeschooling your kids during the pandemic. We saw a lot of attacks from places like Washington Post, where they're saying that homeschooling during coronavirus will set back a generation of students, and you saw other attacks. And the most famous one was from a Harvard law professor named Elizabeth Bartholet. She wrote an 80-page Arizona Law Review article calling for what you alluded to, a presumptive ban on the practice of homeschooling. If you want me to continue, I can explain exactly what she means by a presumptive ban if you'd like.
Yeah, let's dive into that.
Yeah, so a presumptive ban, the basic idea is that you put the burden of proof on the parents to prove to the government or other official that you are worthy of educating your children in your own home. In the current scenario, in the current day and age, it's the opposite of that. The burden of proof is what I would argue is correctly on the government to have to prove to society as to why they should be able to take your kids away from you. If you're abusing your kids, or if you're not providing them an education, the government then steps in and takes your kids away. But what Elizabeth Bartholet is arguing is the completely turning that upside down, essentially, and putting the burden of proof on the families, essentially assuming everyone's guilty until proven innocent. And our legal system doesn't work like that. Our homeschooling system doesn't work like that today. So that's why there was so much backlash to this it really started when this article called The Risks of Homeschooling came out in Harvard Magazine, which kind of detailed in short form what she was arguing for in her longer piece that was 80 pages in the Arizona Law Review. So, I mean, the basic argument is that, homeschoolers are just doing this to abuse their children or to not provide them with an education, which is just totally ridiculous of an argument. But it gets even worse than that because because of how she makes that argument. If you just do a Control F, for people who are technically savvy with computers, Control F is just a basic find function in the PDF of her 80-page paper. If you just look for the words some or many, those words combined come up 210 times in her article, and that very much highlights the main problem with her line of reasoning, that she just uses fear-mongering. She says that, some homeschool parents might do this, or many homeschool parents are doing this or that or the other, but she doesn't actually back up her claims with hard statistics or facts, and she doesn't compare the instances of negative occurrences happening in the home to the real-world instances of negative occurrences happening in our government-run schools, which are the realistic counterfactual to what would happen if you had a presumptive ban on the practice of homeschooling. So, for example, a 2008 report from the Department of Education in the United States found that 1 in every 10 kids, or at least estimated that 1 in every 10 kids, would experience sexual maltreatment from the educators themselves by the time they reach or finish high school. And that doesn't even count all of the unreported abuse that occurs. Another 2010 report from the Government Accountability Office has estimated that the sexual misconduct that's going on with the educators, that these educators will pass through 3 different school districts before it's actually caught and before they're actually held accountable for these actions. So a lot of this goes unreported, and they also estimated that one educator that's engaging in this type of misconduct can have up to as many as 72 victims during his or her lifetime. So this is rampant, problems that happens in the government-run system. And if you applied Elizabeth Bartholet's logic to the entire system overall, if anything, we should have a presumptive ban on government schooling, not a presumptive ban on homeschooling, because the evidence overwhelmingly shows that homeschoolers tend to do better educationally, and kids tend to be abused at lower rates when they're in their homes than they are in the government-run school system. But she doesn't do that. She doesn't compare between sectors. She just tries to focus on things that may happen. And just think if you applied this logic to anything else in life. Just imagine if we said, and the logic here is that, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, you should have nothing to hide. The first thing that's wrong with that is that I don't trust the government officials to get it right. They don't get it right with the government school system, right? And they have all sorts of bias that can be introduced. Maybe they don't like Christians or conservatives homeschooling, and so maybe they'll have a negative bias towards them. You look at the Harvard Magazine article, you can see all of this bias against conservatives and Christians in that article and in Elizabeth Bartholet's longer form article. But then, you can see that there could be discrimination against people who have lower education levels or lower income levels, or there might even be discrimination on the basis of, your background, your race, that is systemic in the government systems. So I don't trust that to happen. But then also just think about the logic behind that. You could essentially get rid of the 4th and 5th Amendment, right? Because if you have nothing to hide, you shouldn't have anything to worry about with the cops coming into your homes unannounced to see if you have drugs that are, because if you don't have drugs, then you should have nothing to hide, right? That's the logic behind getting rid of the 4th Amendment. And the 5th Amendment, if you have nothing to hide, well, you should be able to speak when questioned by officers. And so you shouldn't have a right against self-incrimination either, is the logic there. And then just think about it. You could say that we want all kids to be healthy, right? We want them to eat healthy things, but that doesn't mean that we should punish 100% of families without any evidence of wrongdoing by having government officials come and eat dinner with you every night. I don't want to pay a government official to do that, and I don't want them to infringe on my liberties and privacy because, well, if you don't have anything to hide, you should have nothing to worry about having that logic. But it gets even worse than that, and I know I'm going longer than I should in the initial question, but I feel like I need to hit on this because Elizabeth Bartholet refuted herself on this logic back in 2014 in a Russia Today live video interview. And you can find it on my Twitter, and if for the listeners, I can help you and provide a link straight to this conversation where she was arguing for international adoption, and the person on the other end from Russia was arguing against international adoption. And that person was saying, well, look, there's this one anecdote of this negative event that occurred with international adoption, so we should get rid of it altogether. And Elizabeth Bartholet, the Harvard law professor, was saying, no, you shouldn't use the exception to prove the rule. You shouldn't make perfect the enemy of the good, because overall the evidence suggests that relative to the government institution, allowing families to adopt internationally leads to on net good outcomes. So if you're looking at the preponderance of the evidence, it's actually a good outcome. Yes, there are cases of abuse that could happen, but that doesn't mean we should get rid of it altogether and scrap it altogether. And so she even threatened to leave the interview because she correctly understood that the Russia Today interviewer was not being fair and that they were using anecdotes and not evidence. But then fast forward 6 years later to 2020, Elizabeth Bartholet is using that same logic that the Russia Today interviewer was using in saying that we should ban homeschooling for everyone because of these possibilities of rare negative events to occur. So she told the Russia Today interviewer that we should not ban international adoptions based on rare instances of negative events occurring because overwhelmingly it's a good thing. So she should apply that same logic to her homeschooling argument today, but if she did, she would have to argue to not ban homeschooling based on rare cases of negative events. But again, she doesn't really cite statistics to base. It's mostly just this could happen, this might happen. And I will say it's not just a presumptive ban, because if you look into her other interviews that are more recent, she actually argues that even if families are deemed worthy of educating their children by these benevolent and omniscient bureaucrats, that she still believes that those families should be required to send their kids to the government-run schools for a couple of courses and also extracurricular activities. So for most homeschoolers, we would define that as not homeschooling. We would define that as you still have to send your kid to the government school. That's still a ban on homeschooling. You see the German, some people in Germany do this as well, because Germany, for the listeners who don't know, have an outright ban on homeschooling, but some Germans will come out and say, no, we don't have a ban on homeschooling because we do allow you to homeschool your kids when they're not at school. You can still educate your kids, at dinner time. That's still, so they'll say, oh, we don't have a ban on homeschooling, even though they require families to send their kids to a brick and mortar school, whether that's a government run school or private. I would call that a ban on homeschooling, just as I would call Bartholet's idea to ban homeschooling altogether a ban on homeschooling altogether, where you still have to send your kid to the government-run school for a couple of courses. That's an outright ban. But what she does is, and what some Germans do, is that they'll change the definition of homeschooling so that their proposal doesn't sound as crazy. But look, any homeschooler in this day and age would say that's an outright ban. And I think she would also prefer to ban private schooling as well, because if you look at her 80-page Arizona Law Review article, she devotes one short page to private schooling where she says, hey, private schools have some of the same problems as homeschooling in that you can isolate your kids from public, quote unquote, public values if you send them to a private school. But she doesn't really take it a step further and say that I want to ban homeschooling too, but she does allude to it at least. And if she's applying the same logic that she did to homeschooling, I think she's kind of projecting that, or hinting at least that we should, in her view, ban private schooling altogether as well, which luckily in the United States was found unconstitutional. When Oregon tried to do so in 1922, they banned private schooling altogether. The KKK actually pushed for this in 1922 in Oregon. They succeeded for a couple of years until 1925. The Supreme Court case, Pierce versus Society of Sisters, where the leading justice was famously quoted in saying that the child is not the mere creature of the state. And I think some people need to remember that when it comes to homeschooling as well.
Yeah, no, that's why I was really drawn to your coverage of this, because there seems to be something almost nefarious behind all this. On top of what Elizabeth Bartholet was saying, you have the head of the law department at Harvard, James Dwyer, coming out and claiming that the reason the parent-child relationships exist is because the state confers legal parenthood, which is just crazy to think about. As somebody who's a new father, I have a 4-month-old son. That statement alone enrages me.
I mean, it essentially means that it's this view that you're not a parent unless the government says you're allowed to be a parent. So biology be damned. It's just because we tell you that it's okay for you to be a parent. That means that and most people get pretty, there's a pretty rough reaction to this. You've seen it before with MSNBC's. She's not affiliated with them anymore, but Melissa Harris Perry similarly saying the same kind of thing, where there's this private notion that the child belongs to the parent, but in reality, she argues that the child belongs to the whole community, which I think some would think of as the government as well. And so there was a lot of pushback then. There was a lot of pushback when James Dwyer said this. I found another interview. He did this. He was actually on a debate, I think in 2007, with James Sekulow, where he made the same kind of argument that he doesn't think that, the children belong to the family unit, which I can kind of get behind that too, because the child belongs to themselves, right? I mean, the child is more, belongs more to the family, I would say, than the government. And I think that's what most people kind of push back on. But even more recently, I also found that in 2012 or 2014, James Dwyer has a Alabama Law Review article. It's also published on SSRN if you want to see the free version. But he makes the argument that, I don't remember the title of this, but again, I'll send you the link for your listeners. But he actually argues that if you live in a quote unquote dangerous neighborhood, that he believes that the state should be able to come and take your child away from you unless you forcibly move to another neighborhood. So he argues that if you want to be able to keep your kid, you should be able to do that, but you should only be able to do that if you move to a neighborhood that I deem safe. So just think about all the inequities that can result from this. I mean, it's essentially a policy that would lead to lower income families not being able to have kids, or at least not being able to keep their kids because they wouldn't be able to afford to move into these quote unquote safe neighborhoods. And, why should, some academic at Harvard be able to tell you where to move, and why should they be able to take your children away from you? I think that's an extremely dangerous argument to make, and an extremely dangerous and authoritarian policy recommendation. And you look, I mean, you can see that kind of bleeding over into this homeschooling debate as well. And I should also point out that, the point we're bringing up, the reason we're bringing up James Dwyer as well, in addition to Elizabeth Bartholet, is because they were the two co-organizers of a conference that was supposed to happen this month, or in June of this summer of 2020. That was the complete focus was an anti-homeschooling conference. They didn't invite any pro-homeschooling speakers to come and present their ideas at It was supposed to be held at Harvard Law School until coronavirus came up, and they just completely canceled the conference, at least until next year. But if you look at the event description, you don't just have to look at the people who are invited to speak, but if you look at the event description, it said something along the lines of the focus of this conference is going to be on the problems of educational maltreatment and child abuse that too often occurs under the guise of homeschooling. So it's an explicitly anti-homeschooling event. And it was also private. If you were a homeschooling parent, you couldn't just come and experience the conference as a listener even. It was completely closed off, and none of the people in my network, I know a lot of homeschooling parents and families and homeschooling supporters, none of them were invited to even be a participant of the conference. But in response to that, Harvard Kennedy School invited 6 panelists, I believe 6 or 7 panelists. I was lucky enough to be one of them, to kind of counter this event. And we made our event open to the public. It was called the Disinformation Campaign Against Homeschooling. We responded to all the arguments by Elizabeth Bartholet and James Dwyer and the others. And we made it open to the public on Zoom. We had a large turnout, and people can still see it. It's recorded if you want to go check it out. But we even explicitly invited Elizabeth Bartholet to come listen to our views and ask questions if she had any. I don't believe she actually listened to our discussion. But if you want to go check it out to see our arguments, you can as well.
Yeah. And it's fascinating too, because if I understand correctly, Elizabeth Bartholet doesn't have any children, and her...
Yeah, I think she might have adopted some children or something. but yeah, I mean that is an interesting thing to think about too.
Well, I mean, just like skin in the game and thinking about decisions, top-down decisions specifically that affect everybody, and that's again what we focus on in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a monetary good that allows individuals to opt in a grassroots, bottom-up fashion. The market just decides that this is a good money and coalesces on that, and then schooling, it should be opt-in as well, especially here in America, and the fact that there is at least a school of thought that is trying to stop that is frightening, because the way I understand these systems, trying to micromanage complex systems like monetary system or an educational system tends to make everybody worse off in the long run, because you can't micromanage complex systems. And
yeah, it's true. It's always some top-down rule it's always decisions made by a bunch of people who don't have skin in the game, right? And who has more skin in the game than the child's actual parents, right? And so, one of the best arguments for school choice and even just other types of educational freedom like homeschooling is that the parents just have the best incentives to get it right, because if they get it wrong, well, it's their own children, and then they are pretty much held accountable pretty strongly in the public eye if they do get it wrong, and with their families and networks if they do get it wrong. And they just have the most information available to know what's best for their own individual children's needs when it comes to education and a whole host of other services that are provided to their children. And to your point, there is actually a pretty good interview that came out after all this controversy with Elizabeth Bartlett. I think it was called the Off the Trail Learning Podcast. If you just want to look it up, Off the Trail Learning, Elizabeth Bartlett, you should be able to find it on Google. But one of the first questions that the interviewer asked was do you have any experience with homeschooling? And Bartlett quickly responded, no, I just have the research that I've written recently, and I didn't homeschool any children, and I wasn't homeschooled myself. But, so it seems kind of strange that she has this very strong policy recommendation to have an outright ban that I would call it an outright ban on homeschooling for a bunch of other families when she hasn't actually experienced it herself. That isn't to say that she can't make arguments about homeschooling, but it is kind of telling that, and it is some additional background that most people didn't know, that she didn't really have any experience with homeschooling firsthand. She just read a couple of articles and had a couple of theories that there might be some abuse happening with homeschooling, but she doesn't really have any evidence for that. I will say she does cite one study to make the claim that kids are abused at higher rates in homeschooling, which is not true. But she does cherry pick one study that has 28 hand-picked cases of abuse from a researcher named Barbara Knox, published in 2014, where she just looks at these 28 cases of extreme abuse and generalizes to the entire population of homeschool families. You can't really say anything about a sample size of 28 students, especially when the authors themselves say you shouldn't run statistical tests on these on the sample, because one, it's a small sample, but because two, we handpicked these students to tell a particular story. So they even came out and said that. So you can't really say much of anything about that. And there is also a more recent review of the literature on this by Brian Ray, published in 2018, that found that most of the studies find no difference in rates of abuse. But if you had to call it either way, most of the cases find that homeschoolers are abused at actually lower rates than the kids in regular or conventional school settings. So look, she either cherry picks or uses studies that you can't really say much of anything about. So yeah, that's another thing to consider when it comes to this debate. And the last thing I want to point out on this in particular is that this came at an especially odd time when everybody was essentially homeschooling, that I alluded to earlier, where there was this huge war on homeschooling just as everyone was doing it. We had coronavirus shut down brick and mortar schools for essentially 100% of students in the United States, and whether you like it or not, families were homeschooling during this time. And so there was this all-out war on homeschooling when families essentially didn't have any other option in place. So it really came off as extremely tone-deaf to launch this attack at this time.
Yeah, it seemed like a hey, I know you're all doing this right now, but here's why it's bad. And
I've kind of theorized that enemies of homeschooling and the government school monopolies came out against homeschooling at this time because they knew that families were homeschooling, right? They know that it's a threat to their monopoly system, and they know that families are figuring out that, whoa, my schools weren't really providing much meaningful services. And look, my children are learning a lot right now. They're actually happy. They're not stressed out from getting bullied all day, and they're not stressed out from having to sit in a desk all day and have to focus on things that they're not really interested in. When they're at home, they can self-direct their learning, feel a lot more confident about themselves and get a lot more learning done in things that they're actually interested in a fraction of the time. And look, a lot of parents were reporting, at least anecdotally, that their kids were really feeling less anxious, less stressed out, a lot happier. And that's a really big deal for a lot of families. And we've had a lot of surveys come out, and I'll just cite a couple of them, but there have been a ton that have been showing essentially the same thing, that there's going to be an exodus away from government schools next year. The first one was from EdChoice in just a couple months ago when this all started. They found that the majority of families, 52%, reported that they now have a more favorable view of homeschooling as a direct result of COVID-19, even though this is a watered down version of homeschooling when everybody was locked in their homes and they couldn't go to theaters or community services. They couldn't do any homeschool co-op options. So it was like the worst case scenario for homeschooling, and families were still saying in overwhelming numbers that they really liked it. Only half of that proportion, 26%, said they had a less favorable view of homeschooling. Of course, there were some families that would say, I really don't like this. I want to go back to normal. But overwhelmingly, twice that proportion said that they had a more favorable view of homeschooling. USA Today more recently said 60% of families said that they were likely to continue homeschooling or virtual schooling, even if schools opened up in the fall. And then the most recent survey was from Gallup that happened in June, and they said that families across the United States, 44% said that they didn't want to return to brick and mortar schools in the fall, even if the schools reopened. They want some form of part-time or full-time virtual learning in the fall, and they want their children to do so from home. So that's a lot of students, 44%. And also pretty recently, American Federation for Children did a similar survey. 40% said of families in the United States said that they wanted to continue homeschooling, or they were at least likely to continue homeschooling even if schools opened up next year. There were other polls, but I don't want to get into all of them. But there was a bunch of numbers suggesting that there's going to be a big change. And as I've theorized in a Washington Examiner magazine piece, that look, even if only 2% of families switched, we're seeing surveys suggesting a lot more. But let's just imagine only 2% of families switch to homeschooling next year. That would still be, do some quick math on that, 50 million kids are in government-run schools before the closure. That's a million students that could switch to homeschooling. And considering the fact that only around 1.7 million families or children were homeschooling before the pandemic, that's about a 59% relative increase in homeschoolers next year. That's a huge increase relative to that small base. But it looks like it might even be much bigger than the 2% switch that I was initially theorizing when I wrote this article. And I think that's why a lot of enemies of homeschooling and enemies, or at least proponents of protecting the status quo of the government school monopoly, are really freaking out right now. Because even if it's true that there's a lot of families that are figuring out that they don't like homeschooling, I don't think that's going to be the case, because a lot of them are reporting the opposite. But those families weren't homeschooling in the first place. So the best case scenario for the enemies of homeschooling is that the numbers revert to the long-term trend from before of a 3% proportion of families homeschooling next year. But they were already doing that. But I think there's going to be some proportion, even if it's only 1%, that's 500,000 more students homeschooling next year. But I think it's going to be bigger than that. And I think that's why there's this big freak out going on right now and big attack on homeschooling. It's because the enemies of homeschooling know that when it comes to the numbers, they have nothing to gain and everything to lose.
Yeah, that's what I thought was so interesting about the points that Elizabeth was harping on, again, like anecdotes and really making broad brush assumptions and focusing on abuse instead of quality of education. And somebody who I've done a lot of research on, listened to a lot of his talks when he was still with us, Joseph Gatto, who was head of education in New York State for quite some time, and the way he explains how the Prussian model of schooling was exported to the United States, and we've just been running with that model for almost a century now, and it may not be advantageous for individuals learning. It is more of an indoctrination system than an actual system focused on learning.
I mean, yeah, Gatto highlights that history very well from Prussia, and then even in Massachusetts when it started in 1852, the first compulsory education law in the United States. You look at quotes from Benjamin Rush, Horace Mann, the father of quote unquote public education in America. You look at quotes from other leaders during the time, and I have a thread of this on Twitter as well, going through these arguments. But the explicit arguments were that, look, we have a lot of immigrants coming in, a lot of Catholics coming in. We want them to be more Protestant-like. We want them to be more American, good American citizens, as they, whatever they thought was at the time, and that meant more Protestant. And that's why they argued for common schools. It was for the explicit purpose of making people more homogenous and to create a more uniform population. So it was about social engineering and social control, which I think a lot of people who like the public education system today would find pretty abhorrent when you hear the rhetoric about, oh, those immigrants are just, not good American citizens. I think in today's day and age, people kind of understand that the whole point of America is to have this kind of, melting pot, or, like kind of at least a salad bowl of different cultures, kind of, and embracing this idea of pluralism and allowing people to have their own cultures and not forcing them into this particular mold that the majority thinks that everyone else should act like. I think most people kind of understand that today. And so, look, that was the argument a long time ago. And I just came out with a study. It just got accepted for publication at Social Science Quarterly on this very question with Angela Dills, a professor at Western Carolina University. And we found that compulsory education laws in the United States, and we use this kind of natural experiment kind of analytic technique because compulsory education laws were staggered in the United States. Different states had different timing of those laws. And we found that after states adopted these different types of laws, we found reductions in innovation as measured at least by productivity per worker and patents per capita. And the theory there is that switching from home-based education, or at least switching from this kind of private education model to this more compulsory, rigid, structured factory model of schooling crushes creativity and stifles innovation. And that's what we found in our study. It's forthcoming at Social Science Quarterly. The working paper is available at the Reason Foundation if you want to go check it out. I think the title's called, I should know my own title, but I write quite a bit. So I think it's Does Compulsory Schooling Affect Innovation? I'm pretty sure that's the title if you want to go look it up on Google. But yes, I think you're right. That was the whole point of the compulsory education model today, to stifle innovation, to crush creativity, to create a more uniform populace. And even if that's not the explicit intentions of people today, that's how the system was created. And I still think if you look at certain aspects of the system that we have today, like standardized testing, like memorization on tests, in order to have a uniform curriculum, you saw the push for Common Core. You see the focus on obedience and really harsh discipline for students, with having to raise your hand for every single time you want to talk about things. If you want to just go to the restroom, you have to raise your hand. A lot of times the teachers will. So it seems a lot about more about obedience than actual learning. And so we still see aspects of that today.
Yeah. And again, like these are nefarious actor bells are going off in my head, specifically with Common Core, because Common Core blows my mind because that's instituted, and then you create sort of division in the family. The parents can't help these students with their homework, and the students are dependent on the state to tell them how to do this thing, and it further drives them away from a relationship or the ability of the parents to foster their children.
Yeah, and what's interesting is a lot of these attacks against homeschooling is people like Elizabeth Bartholet arguing that parents are going to quote unquote indoctrinate their children. And it's like, please, come on. Don't act like the government-run schools don't indoctrinate children in a particular type of fashion. It could just be that the people who are arguing against homeschooling like the form or prefer the form of indoctrination that's occurring in the government-run schools today, which might be more of a leftward-leaning form of indoctrination. And a more secular form of indoctrination, anti-religious type of indoctrination that they could prefer in the government school system, whether you like it or not. I mean, it's really hard to have a extremely, even if you're trying to create an unbiased system, there's always going to be a uniform system where you're going to have some actors inflicting their views on the students, whether you like it or not, whether it's intentional or not. That's just how it occurs when you have children in a system for 13 years of their lives, where they're sitting there in a classroom with various teachers for 7.5, 8 hours a day for 13 years of their lives. It's just bound to happen. And if you look at Bartholet's articles and her attacks on homeschooling, and even in her interviews, some of the biggest things she points out is she tries to appeal to anti-religious bigotry and anti-conservative bigotry. And I'm not conservative, I'm not religious myself, but I understand that families have the First Amendment right to freely exercise their own religions and pursue religious educations. But she'll point out things like, oh, well, there's a lot of families that are conservative and Christians who are homeschooling. And my first response is, who cares? They have the right to do so. Just because they're conservative doesn't mean homeschooling itself is a bad thing, and doesn't mean that that conservatism is a bad thing. It doesn't mean that religion is a bad thing per se. It doesn't mean that people don't have the right to freely exercise that religious education. But secondly, she actually cites a statistic. Most of the time she doesn't cite statistics. As I said, she uses the word some or many 210 times in her article. But one of the few statistics she cites, she doesn't even get it right. She says that 90% of families are doing so for religious reasons, or that they are religious homeschoolers. If you look at the U.S. Department of Education report on this most recent one, I think it was in 2019, they report that the number one and number two reasons is for safety or academics. Religion isn't the number one reason for homeschooling. It's because they're trying to escape bullying in the traditional system, or it's just because they're just not satisfied with the academic instruction that they're getting in the government school system. I mean, if you look at the most recent Nation report card that just came out, I think about a month ago, they found that only 15% of students were proficient in U.S. history, and about 3 out of every 4 students were not proficient in civics or geography. The more recent results even found that came out before those were for math and reading, finding that, again, about 3 out of every 4 students are not proficient in math, and about 2 out of every 3 students are not proficient in reading in the United States. So there's a lot of miseducation going on in the traditional system. So it really seems strange for enemies of homeschooling to try to make the claim that homeschoolers are not getting an adequate education when they're the kids obviously aren't getting an adequate education in the government-run school system. And then another argument I just want to point out is that people believe that homeschoolers are not being properly socialized. And it's like, come on. Homeschoolers avoid a lot of negative socialization. They avoid a lot of the bullying. They avoid a lot of the obedience training. They avoid a lot of the gang activity, drugs, sexual misconduct going on with the teachers and other students. They avoid a lot of this negative forms of socialization, which is, if that's your definition of socialization, maybe it's a good thing that homeschool families are not, or homeschool students are not exhibiting or kind of being socialized in these ways, but they also have more time to experience positive forms of socialization. You look at a 2019 report published in the Peabody Journal of Education by Professor Daniel Hamlin from the University of Oklahoma. He used a nationally representative sample of students that are, the data are publicly available. I think it was about 15,000 students he looked at, even after controlling it for a bunch of different background characteristics, such as income levels of the families, the race of the students, and a whole bunch of different characteristics of the families and the students. He found that homeschool students were overwhelmingly much more likely to experience family and community activities than the kids in the government-run schools, even after controlling for differences in the families and the students. So that just goes to show that they have more opportunity. It could be because they're not stuck in government schools for 7.5, 8 hours a day. They have more time to do these community activities, such as going to concerts, going to the museums, these culturally enriching activities with their families. So that's another thing to consider as well in this debate. But if you look at that 90% claim from Elizabeth Bartholet, that 90% of families are doing so for religious or conservative, or just because they're conservative families, more legitimate evidence coming from Carrie McDonald has cited suggests that only about 2/3 of families are Christians or religious families, which tends to mirror the population. So they're not actually even more representative than the average family in the population. But again, to go back to my original point, it shouldn't really matter if they're conservatives, even if it was 90%, right? And if you go to her footnotes in her paper, you try to find that 90% number, it goes to a blog post that doesn't even cite a source for a 90% number. So one, if you're like a peer-reviewed journal article, why are you publishing sources and footnotes that are just going to blog posts? That doesn't seem very scientific to me. And again, I do also want to point out, when she does contend with evidence, she'll discredit any positive findings in any way she can. And she'll say, look, it's not the whole population of homeschool students. It's just, 20,000 or 10,000 of them. It's not the whole population. And any scientist or social scientist would find that as an over the top kind of bar to place on studies, because I don't know of much of any studies that use the entire population. You usually get a sample from that population and you try to draw some conclusions, and you do the best you can with the data that you have. And having, thousands and thousands of observations is actually pretty good for social science. But what's funny is she turns around and says, oh, look, they're not observing the whole population. But then she turns around on the next page and tries to say that homeschoolers are abused at higher rates by citing a study with 28 students. Come on. Yeah. And then she also commits ad hominem whenever she does contend with evidence. She'll attack people like Brian Ray and just say he's an advocate without actually dealing with the fact that he's using legitimate data that's publicly available, and he's citing other people that aren't himself in a literature review of the evidence that overwhelmingly finds that most of the studies conclude that homeschool children fare better academically and socially than their otherwise similar peers in the government school system. She doesn't deal with that. She goes to the ad hominem attacks. And then she goes and cites a study that, one, only has 28 students that are cherry-picked kind of cases of abuse. And then she cites a study that is authored by Barbara Knox, who was under investigation last year for allegedly pressuring her colleagues to find abuse when abuse actually wasn't there. She actually just stepped down from her $208,000 a year salary job amid that investigation. Which isn't an admission of guilt, but it doesn't look very good when you're getting paid this huge salary, and then during the investigation just last year for pressuring your colleague to, or allegedly pressuring your colleague to find abuse that wasn't actually there, seems pretty fishy. And it's just kind of strange that if you're going to attack the positive studies for quote unquote bias and the character of the authors, it seems pretty strange that she doesn't do the same thing when it comes to the negative homeschooling studies. And what it looks like to me, when you look through this article and you look at the entire 80 pages, it looks like she has the conclusion she wants, which is, I want to have a presumptive ban or an outright ban on homeschooling. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to either ignore all the positive evidence, or I'm going to look at some of the positive evidence and do everything I can to discredit it by making the perfect the enemy of the good when it comes to the sample size. And I'm going to do a character assassination of the authors. But when it comes to the negative studies that exist, I'm going to cherry pick those results, and I'm going to elevate the ones that find negative evidence of homeschooling, even though the authors themselves say that you shouldn't really make any broad conclusions from these results. And then don't attack the characters of those authors. It seems like it's there's and I don't like to question the motives of people, but it just seems strange that there's this imbalance of elevating the negative studies, and then squashing at every chance you can the positive studies of homeschooling.
Yeah, it seems very agenda driven. And as somebody who has experienced 4 different types of schooling, I've been to a Montessori school, I've been to a friend school, I've been to public school, and then a private Catholic school for high school and college. I've seen a range. I've never been homeschooled, but I am thinking about it for my own children in the future. Public school is easily the worst experience out of the 4, and you felt like you were in a prison. And one thing you've been tweeting a lot about recently, I hope I'm getting this correct, I don't have any tweets pulled up, but a lot of people will combat the line that public school education has really depreciated significantly over time. And they'll be like, oh, but the government's defunding schools, and you have been pointing out that that's actually not the case per capita. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there was a few viral posts that went around. I think just one, the one you're probably thinking of, had over 600,000 likes in a few days. 600,000 for your listeners, just in case you didn't hear that, based on a lie. They said something along the lines, defunding police sounds radical and all until you think about the fact that we've been essentially defunding education for years. It was just some random person, a coach from California in a high school there. Kamala Harris said the same thing in the New York Times, and they didn't issue a correction, even though I called them out on this. She said, look, she said essentially the same thing. It was in the discussion about police, and she said, well, we've been defunding public schools for years, or public education for years. No, we haven't. If you look at real inflation adjusted per pupil expenditures in the United States since 1960, we've increased them by 280% between 1960 and 2017 in real terms. Yes, that's adjusted for inflation. And if you look every decade, it's increased at the national level. If you're counting total expenditures per pupil adjusted for inflation, it's not just that I'm choosing a particular base year to get a result that I want. If you look at every single base, 1960, 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, 2017, there's consistent increases each decade in real terms. And so we haven't been defunding education for years. That's just a complete lie. I think what people mean is that the money's being wasted, to which I'll respond, yeah. But that means that we shouldn't pour more money into a system that wastes money. We should attach those dollars to the child, attach those dollars to the family unit, and let the family decide what the best educational experience is for their child, whether it's a charter school, a private school, a government school, a district school, a magnet school, whether it's a homeschooling option. It doesn't matter to me. You can choose whatever type of school you want, or unschool or homeschool option. But the money should be attached to the child or the individual family unit, so that that schools have a very strong incentive to actually allocate those dollars effectively. It could be the case that it looks like our schools are being defunded over time, but that's because all the money's going to administrative bloat, increases in staffing, going to water slides and football fields, and not actually going towards the classroom. But if you add a real incentive to allocate those dollars wisely, the increases in funding would actually be spent wisely. And that doesn't take a lot of thinking to understand, right? If you know that you can waste money over time and your customers don't have a real meaningful exit option, well, you're going to just spend the money on whatever you want. You might not even know what the best thing to spend the money on is, because there isn't any bottom-up accountability. In any other market, price signals and kind of people voting with their feet are beneficial in two ways. One, it gives you an incentive to spend the money wisely, but it gives you the information on how to spend the money wisely. So you might not even know that you're doing something wrong that your customers don't like until they get the chance to leave. And then you might start to say, oh crap, what am I doing wrong? And then you start to have an additional incentive to kind of allocate those dollars efficiently. I think you need that bottom-up accountability, because all these top-down measures of accountability are just phony accountability. The only real form of accountability that we have is bottom-up accountability. It's the only way that we're going to see increases in education expenditures actually go to the classroom and go to the most efficient and most effective use of those resources. And I do want to say one more thing on the homeschooling debate. Is I like to bring up the evidence, right? I like to say, like, look, homeschoolers tend to do better. They tend to be abused at lower rates. They tend to, there's a lot of negative events occurring in the government schools. And I like to use statistics to back up my claims, but I want to make another moral case for this as well, that it shouldn't matter what the evidence says overall on average. We should still have the power and the right to choose the educational setting that works best for our kids. Let's just imagine if the evidence overall said that homeschoolers got a little bit lower test scores on average. That wouldn't be a legitimate argument to take the right of families to choose their children's education away from them. Our rights do not hinge on what academics conclude in their studies based on averages, and our rights do not hinge on what the average says. I could be really doing a really great job for my child, and let's say this report comes out that says that on average homeschoolers get lower test scores, but my child may be knocking it out of the water. They may be in the top percentile of students on standardized tests. So why why should that average ever be used against me as a family? Why should decisions of other families take away my right to choose to homeschool my own children? It doesn't make any sense. And it's something I need to keep reminding listeners that although I use evidence to back up my claims, and although the evidence is positive for homeschooling, our rights don't hinge on what the evidence or what academics tell us a particular study shows on average. But that isn't to say that the government should never step in. All I'm saying, and all homeschooling advocates are saying, is that as it currently is today, and is how it should be. That if there is evidence of educational maltreatment in severe cases, or if there is evidence of abuse, then of course the government should step in and take action. We're just saying that Elizabeth Bartlett has it completely backwards, that we shouldn't punish 100% of families for the actions of a few bad actors. We should instead have the government come in after the fact, and the burden of proof should, rightly as it currently is, be placed on the government to convince us why they should be able to take our children away from us. And so that's, I think, the main point I want to make here.
No, it's a very important point to make. Thank you for championing this cause, because it is crazy. Like I said, like Bitcoiners, we focus on taking the control of money out of the state's hands because, like you just described, the public schooling system is terrible at allocating capital, and I would argue that the central bank and the government that benefits from money printing is bad at allocating capital just in general outside of the schooling system as well. And that's why I want to bring you on here. You're championing bottom-up solutions to very, very hard problems, and just heuristically, these problems should be solved at a bottom-up fashion via the individual and the individual family units. And I know we got to wrap up here. You got a jet, but again, thank you for what you're doing. Do you have any parting notes for the freaks out there? Any thoughts on Bitcoin? I know you said you're not really interested in it, but just in case.
I'm interested in it. I just don't know much about it. But yeah, I want to say thanks for having me on your show. And I do think you're right that it is, and again, this is my area of expertise, but it does seem like a bottom-up solution to the monopoly kind of on printing of money that we have with the Federal Reserve, right? And alternatives to the government, or at least Federal Reserve system could incentivize them to do a better job. And that's the same argument that I make with school choice and educational freedom, that this bottom-up accountability can be a tide that lifts all boats.
Yeah, no, I agree. If you ever want to chat about Bitcoin off the record, I'm willing and able to do so. And yeah, keep crushing it, man. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Where can we find out more about you?
As you said, I mean, you found my stuff off of Twitter. So if anyone wants to follow me on Twitter, it's just my last name and then my first name, @DeAngelis Corey. I'm sure you'll put it in the notes. But then also, if you want to find my longer form articles, you can find it at the Reason Foundation website. So if you just want to even Google Corey DeAngelis Reason Foundation, you'll find my work on Google at reason.org.
Awesome. Well, Corey, keep crushing. That's all we got this week, freaks. Peace and love.